Hello there, this is Mark Smith with Family Tree Counseling Associates. I told you I would find a place next to the Golden Gate Bridge, and I, as it turned out, wasn't up to walking all the way. You can see the bridge in the background. But I'm going to be speaking with you today about some cutting edge approaches to treating trauma. On June the 1st through the 5th, I was in Boston and I attended the worldwide conference on treating trauma hosted by Bessel van der Kolk. And so today's presentation is going to be sort of a report from the conference from the perspective of we narcissistic abuse syndrome folks. And so I've got good news and I have bad news. I've got some really cool stories to tell. But the truth is that for the first 2 days of the conference, pretty much all that was spoken about was brain science. In psychology and in trauma treatment, everything is going brain. After 2 days, if somebody would have said the word brain again, I would have wanted to grab them by the throat. I would have traumatized them because I was being traumatized by too much brain, too much focus on the brain. Now, certainly PTSD is a disease of the brain. I'm not trying to minimize that. I'm going to take this off. I'm not trying to minimize that fact, but I went to the conference to find out two things. I went to find out, is all these millions of us out there suffering from narcissistic abuse syndrome, is that known by the leaders in treating PTSD and treating trauma? I would have thought that it was. I found out that they don't know much about it. I also came to learn more about how to treat trauma, how to work with people and treat them for their trauma. And unfortunately, Unfortunately, the first 2 days was better suited for a psychiatrist and not so much a therapist. It was all brain science. And unfortunately, I'm just not a scientific kind of guy. I'm more of a therapist, and I'm a survivor of narcissistic abuse syndrome. So, unfortunately, at this 4-day conference, the phrase narcissistic abuse was never spoken that I heard. Perhaps it was spoken in some of the workshops that I did not attend, but in terms of the ones that I attended, it was never spoken. It was never mentioned. Bessel van der Kolk is a very interesting fellow. Many of you have read his book, and if you haven't read it, you need to. The Body Keeps the Score, where he goes through and systematically discusses all of the treatments for PTSD. And the guy who does the audio book has this lovely voice. He's friendly, he's happy, he's engaging. So in my mind, Bessel van der Kolk was that guy. And then I meet this gruff, hairy Dutchman who has a very deep, gravelly voice. Do you remember the professor in the movie Good Will Hunting? That actor who has sort of a gravelly voice. He sounded like him, and Bessel van der Kolk reminded me of a lion. He was big, he was strong, he was in control. He moved the conference along. At first I thought, perhaps this man has some issues with narcissism, but the more I got to know him through the conference, and I did come up and speak with him, I think he's just a great leader, and he's the straw that stirs the drink, and he brings treatment modalities together. He brings great therapists together, and he's a fantastic leader, and he's direct, and he's a strong personality. But if you're going to achieve in life what he has, then you're going to be that way. So I did go up and talk with him, and I told him that we were from Indianapolis and that we worked with Narcissistic Abuse Syndrome. And I asked him if he knew what it meant. He knew what narcissism was, of course, and he knew what a narcissistic injury was, but probably the leader of the PTSD treatment professional world does not know what narcissistic abuse syndrome is. And like I said, it was never mentioned. And they were talking about trauma from infancy, trauma from child abuse, trauma from rape, trauma from war, but nobody mentioned trauma from being involved with crazy, mean, lying, cheating, ruthless, flying monkey employing narcissist. So it is what it is. We've got our work cut out to do. I'm standing by pier, so the sun wasn't out when I started, so I'm sorry I'm dodging between the shade and the light. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share some highlights from this workshop. And most of the highlights came the last day when they finally got around to freaking talking about how to do therapy with people and how to help people. And that last day was worth its weight in gold. I was so touched by it. I was weeping all through the morning. So one emphasis was on the concept of attachment, and how if a child doesn't attach with a parent, then that child is going to experience great trauma. And there was also emphasis on, if you're going to heal your PTSD, it's not just about the mechanics of EMDR, it's about the relationship between the therapist and the client. One of the authors who was discussed, and I'm going to discuss her book more in just a bit here, is Alice Miller. And Alice Miller, just a brilliant therapist. I believe she's dead now, but she's written some great books. She called the relationship between the therapist and the client, she called the therapist the enlightened witness. And wow, I really love that. That as you go through trauma, you need an enlightened witness. And many of us can't locate a good therapist who can be an adequate enlightened witness. And that's the cool thing about YouTube videos, is these Melody Tanya Evans and the Spartan Life Coach and Ross Rosenberg and even Mark Smith can serve as your enlightened witness. And then the comments on YouTube can serve as your enlightened witness. And the book Psychopath Free can serve as your enlightened witness. So one thing I guess I wanted to stress is that, we use the word narcissist like we use the word murderer or devil. And part of what I got from the conference is it's all about the trauma that a person has gone through. That's what forms them into who they are, is the trauma. And I don't believe people are born as narcissistic predators. I believe that they were abused and abandoned, and now I'm not trying to make excuses for them, because what they got formed into is something that's so dangerous and so hurtful and so untreatable. But my point is, it wasn't a moral choice. Somebody didn't just get up one day and said, I think it'd be fun to be a narcissist. Sometimes Sam Vaktin is criticized and vilified because he knows and he shares with us that he is a diagnosed narcissist. And again, it's not like he chose that. His childhood chose that for him. So it's all about the trauma that can happen even during birth and before birth, and the trauma that gets frozen in time in your body. So let me talk about this Alice Miller, and her book that I'm wanting to recommend is called The Body Never Lies. Bessel van der Kolk says the body keeps score. Alice Miller says the body never lies. The gist of her book is that in our culture, and really for centuries, we have been taught to honor our father and mother and to not question them or confront them for the abuses that they perpetuate. And that if the trauma isn't healed, and if there isn't an enlightened witness, and if you're in denial, and if you're hiding from the truth about yourself, then eventually your trauma, your pain, your abuse is going to come out in your body in some form of manifestation, whether it be asthma or feeling empty and then developing alcohol or drug addiction, strokes, heart attacks, food addiction. It's going to impact your body. And this fascinating book by Alice Miller, what she does is she goes through and discusses the early lives of many famous writers. Chekhov, Edgar Allan Poe, Proust were some of the writers, James Joyce, and she talked about the abuse in their childhood. Virginia Woolf was sexually abused as a child, and then she read Freud's work, and Freud basically said, these kids aren't sexually abused, they're having sexual fantasies and they made it up. And then when Virginia Woolf believed that, she drowned herself late in life, in her late 40s. So Alice Miller went through and discussed famous writers and how many of them met early deaths and suicides because they were holding to honor thy father and mother instead of holding to the truth. And to honor thy father and mother isn't to be in denial about who they were and to pretend who they were. In my case, my psychological defense mechanisms defended me against who I was. At my core, what I was a horrifically abandoned infant who went through massive trauma. But that was covered over with my Christian faith, my workaholism, my family life, my counterdependency. But eventually the truth has a way of coming out, and how Mother Nature brings the truth out is through your love life. The big truth teller is your love life, because you're going to pick somebody very similar to the one who hurt you. And this narcissist that I picked was an exact carbon copy of my mother. My mother did not bond with me as an infant, and she was a fake mother. She pretended to be my mother, but she knew that I was an angry, abandoned, unattached, traumatized little boy at my core. And thankfully, she did notify me of this before she died, but the damage was already done. So the star of the conference was Peter Levine. If you haven't read any of Peter Levine's books and you're seeking to heal from trauma, then I personally think he is the world's leading authority on healing trauma. He reminded me of Yoda, who was just so filled with the Force, so filled with magic, so filled with power, so filled with insight. But he comes packaged as this really sweet older man, really kindly. I did get to meet him, and I told him about the trauma that I went through, and I told him that I put a tattoo of a tiger on my heart. I didn't pull my shirt down and show him the tiger because I thought it would freak him out. But what I was struck with was he was so kind, and he said, "Good luck to you as you continue to heal your trauma." And we just had a couple minutes together, but I was impressed with his compassion. So what Peter Levine says is you need to find the place where the client is stuck and where they're frozen. And I was basically frozen in infancy. Bessel van der Kolk said of Peter Levine that he has a gift of being able to observe people's bodies and sort of tracking their bodies with his own body and being so aware of what the body is saying, because many times the words are saying one thing and the body is saying something else. There's an attraction just above me, and there's a bunch of Boy Scouts up there, so if it gets a little loud, I apologize for that. So it's all about noticing the body. And I think as a therapist, you have to be pretty keenly in touch with your own body in order to have the sensitivity to help people heal in their bodies. I came back home, and there was a fellow in my practice who every session, it was marital sessions, he would pretend this is a big pillow. He would hug a big pillow every session, and that was sort of an expression of his own hiding and his own finding safety. But I had never commented on that. I'd noticed it, but pay attention to people's bodies, pay attention to your own body, and comment on that if you're a therapist. So another thing that stuck out, I forget who said it. I think it was a dance therapist. It was a creative arts therapist. And someone asked her, I think her last name was Thompson, someone asked her, can people work out their issues just through therapeutic dance? And I thought for sure she was going to say yes, because trauma is so in the body. I thought for sure she was going to say yes, but she said no. She said all these creative expressions through the body, whether it be yoga or dance or meditation or massage or EMDR, whatever, she says eventually it needs to be spoken with words. There's something so powerful. So you may not be ready to speak it with words, and dance and art therapy and yoga may get you to a place, but eventually you need to say it. You need to emote. Not only say it, but cry it out. Peter Levine had some very interesting things to say about touch in therapy. He said we exist in a severely touch-deprived society. And we live in a very litigious society, and therapists, if you touch a client, that can be dangerous territory. But he said if somebody is in deep, massive, traumatic pain, Peter Levine said, it was malpractice if you don't touch them. And he said, always get permission. And of course, obviously, you never touch in a sexual way. But they might need a touch on the shoulder. He sort of reads their bodies and he knows where to touch them, but he always gets permission as to whether to touch them. He said touch is 5 times greater in power than just using your facial expression to show empathy. It's 5 times more powerful. So he's a huge proponent of therapists using therapeutic touch, and I'm going to give you an awesome example of that in just a little bit here. But yeah, he reminded me of Yoda trying to teach a young, arrogant, know-it-all Luke Skywalker, and I felt so out of my depth. I didn't even feel like Luke Skywalker. Maybe I was Chewbacca or something. This man knows so much about the body and about trauma and about healing. Anything you can get your hands on from Peter Levine, consume it, digest it. Because this man knows more about healing trauma, I believe, than all of us YouTube gurus put together. Honestly believe that. So, now, let me tell you this story. This is the coolest story. I'm glad to be able to share this with you. He showed a video, and in the video, there was a 14-month-old boy. I think his name was Jack, baby Jack. And this baby had gone through trauma during childbirth. The umbilical cord was wrapped around the baby's neck 3 times, and the baby was born breech, and then they had to use suction to get him out, to get him born. So this poor child had a lot of trauma in his body, and he would clench and clutch his little 14-month-old body with so much stress that he had gastric issues, where he was having gastric juices come up in his throat like an old fart like me would have that needs to take Prilosec to keep that from happening. 14 months old. And he didn't really emotionally deeply attach to his mother, even though he had a fantastic mother. There's a guy in a rowboat with a dog. How cool is that? I arranged that just for you. I have no idea what I was talking about. I'm talking about this story. So, baby Jack was due to have a surgery where they had to stick a camera down his throat. And so that would have just been further trauma for baby Jack. And so Peter Levine acted more quickly. He would have normally spent 2 or 3 sessions building trust with the baby by playing with the baby. But this surgery was scheduled for that week. So he got right down to business. He played with the baby, and he showed the baby some apples, some pomegranates, and then he noticed the baby holding all the tension in his back. So Peter Levine reached over and put his hand on the baby's back. And the baby, the first couple times, took his hand away and said, basically, go away, don't put your hand on my back. But he stayed with it, and he put his hand on his back, and that human touch was so magical and so healing. What happened was the infant started to really cry, really weep, not in a traumatic way, but in a release way. And he had a good long cry, and then he started to sigh deeply in peace. And then he started to smile. And then he started to really snuggle and bond with his mother. So they had three or four more sessions where he would put his hand on the baby's back, and it loosened the trauma up in this infant to where the gastric symptoms went away, and the baby smiled, the baby cuddled, the baby asked for mom. It was like a miracle. I was crying throughout the whole thing. I was crying because I was wishing that there would have been a Dr. Peter Levine for little Mark when he was 14 months old, because I was in much worse shape than this little fellow. I don't know what he'd have done for me, and it probably wouldn't have worked because I didn't have a good mom to carry through with the healing like this fortunate baby did. So the mom brings the baby Jack back when he's 4 and says, "Do you remember Dr. Levine?" And the baby said no. The 4-year-old said no. And then he said, "Hey, is he going to put his hand on my back?" And even at 14 months old, the baby would say apple, because he was remembering the pomegranates that Dr. Levine showed him when he was playing with him. And he associated it with good things. He associated it with attachment. That hand in his back was attachment. And it broke through some trauma, and it helped the baby sleep. It helped the baby attach to mom, and it cleared up the traumatic symptoms in the body. Peter Levine showed another story of a soldier who was, I believe, from Afghanistan, and he was on patrol one day, and he and his best friend stepped on a landmine, and the best friend was killed, and this man was severely injured. And after the physical injuries healed, he would flinch a lot, and they thought he had Tourette's, and he was depressed, and he was traumatized, and he wasn't functioning very well, so they call in Peter Levine. And the guy didn't believe in this hocus pocus trauma treatment stuff, and he just thought it was silly. But the first intervention that Peter Levine did was he noticed that there was a lot of clenching in the jaw, that there was a lot of stress in the jaw. So he just had the soldier stretch and move his jaw around, and then he had the soldier, I don't know how this works, but it's a resonating from deep in one's being. He has them make the sound, and that may sound silly, and I don't know why he does it, but it loosens trauma up in the body. So he did that, and that began to break loose this man's trauma. And then they had some group work where a couple of the other PTSD surviving soldiers would hold this man up, and he would use his arms to hit a pillow. And that was an expression. And during the group, Peter Levine would put his hand on this soldier's shoulder. He was his enlightened witness. So they had, 10 sessions or so. And then we saw the man a couple years later, and he was a whole different person. He was happy. He was married. He'd had a child. He glowed. This guy clearly was not suffering from PTSD. He still isolated some, and he was still grumpy some. So they still had some marital issues. But I wish you could have seen the tightened up, locked down, unemotional, traumatized soldier, and how these simple techniques used by a genius loosened his body up and helped him to heal. So I'm going to try to get some training from Peter Levine and hopefully even some therapy from him. And I encourage all of you to read his books. Healing Trauma. He says, Peter Levine says, trauma is like there's a tiger in the room. And that's why I got a tiger tattooed on my heart. So, and then he played, after the mom was really reunited with the infant, he played the Beatles song, Mother and Child Reunion. It's so cool. So cool. So, at the end of the conference, at the end of the day, the last day, they had something unusual. They sort of had a process meeting where really only maybe a quarter of the folks stuck around, and we sat in a room in a circle like group therapy, and we just shared Quaker style. This is what I learned, this is what I connected with, this is what I want people to know. It was cool. It was a debriefing, and it helped to connect with other people there. So I guess what I'm saying is read Alice Miller, everything you can get your hands on. Read Peter Levine. Watch YouTube videos of Peter Levine. You know, he's an older fellow and he has a very slow cadence, and watching the Spartan Life Coach is a lot more fun because he's so cool and he's so funny and he's so knowledgeable. But Peter Levine is a genius, and he's worked for many decades gaining his wisdom and knowledge and healing trauma. And like I said, I also came away from a conference on trauma where people don't understand the main place where trauma happens. The main place where trauma happens on a day-to-day basis isn't rape. It's not murder. It's not terrorist attacks. It's everyday relationships with these vicious narcissists and borderlines and histrionics and antisocial personality people that you and I have been decimated by, and there wasn't even mentioned. We have work to do to train therapists. It's up to us to train the therapists, because even the therapist teachers don't know enough about it. So I hope you've enjoyed the bridge in the background and the rowboat and the dog and my cool shirt. And I don't know if it's cool or silly, but trauma is an exciting field to be in. There's so much to be learned. There's so much to be gained, and everybody's in the conversation. So feel free to make lots of comments on this video and pass it along to your therapist. And let's sort of shout from the rooftops that trauma can be treated, trauma can be healed. The more you know, the better. And seek help from the best treatment providers in the world, even if they're not hip to narcissistic abuse syndrome. If you have not joined our YouTube channel, please do that. Family Tree Counseling on YouTube. I've got some nice ebooks on abandonment and shame and affair recovery at familytreecounseling.com. I'm going to go ride in an open top bus around San Francisco for 2 hours, and then I have the Segway tour, and then I got Game 6 with my son at a bar, hoping Golden State loses so I can go to Game 7 with my son on Father's Day. So it's all good. Thanks for watching, folks. God bless.